Welcome again to our Interfaiths podcast for our FIU online course. My name is Professor Iqbal Akhtar in the Department of Religious Studies and Politics and International Relations, and we're very honored today to have Professor Juan Cole at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, who is one of the top scholars of, I'd say, the Islamic world, Middle East, with us here today. He's here for a conference. We were very lucky to grab him for a few minutes. So I think let's get started. Maybe talk to us a little bit about your background and kind of how you got, maybe a little bit about kind of where you grew up and how what took you on this path. I know you went on a Fulbright to India eventually, but kind of what was kind of your early experiences that might have geared you towards kind of this type of intellectual journey?
Sure. My father was in the U.S. military, and I grew up traveling. I went to 12 schools in 12 years, and we had 2 long tours in Europe, in France. And when I was a teenager, we had a posting a year and a half in Eritrea. It was then part of Ethiopia. Eritrea is a multicultural place. It's probably a third Muslim. It's a multicultural place, Eritrea, about 1/3 Muslim, 2/3 Christian.
Okay.
There were mosques, and you heard the call to prayer, and we had Eritrean Muslim friends. So that was my first serious contact with the Muslim world there in the Horn of Africa. And then when I got back to the States, it was the late 60s, but still the 60s.
Right.
So, my generation was interested in spirituality, alternative states of consciousness. I read a lot about Sufism, for instance. So when I went to college at Northwestern, I majored in the history of religions. I was very interested in all the world religions, but especially, I would say, in Asian ones. So Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism were special interests of mine. And I began actually taking Arabic when I was an undergraduate. I was only 19 when I started. This is early for most Americans.
Of course.
Often they don't get to Arabic until they're already graduate students. Right. I think that was something that helped me as I had an early exposure to it. So we had a wonderful program at Northwestern called the Traveling Scholars. It had been endowed by an alumnus, and I was able to, all of us, it was a competition. So you designed a research project. I had a friend who designed a project on Dickens's London. So he would go around to the places that were described in novels and to set it into context. So I put together a project on Christian-Muslim dialogue in Lebanon. After the Second Vatican Council, there was an encouragement by the Catholic Church of dialogue with the other religions. And the Second Vatican Council's documents about Islam are actually quite positive and talks about, from a Catholic point of view, it talks about the light of Christ being present in Islam, praises Muslims for honoring Jesus and Mary. It was a document you couldn't have imagined it a century before. So the church was encouraging Catholic intellectuals to engage with their Muslim counterparts. And of course, Lebanon was a perfect place for this. So there were a series of dialogue meetings, and some publications came out of it. Some high-powered Lebanese intellectuals were involved. So I had read about it, and I wanted to go and interview the principals, the participants, and I was able to get this grant from Northwestern to go. I had already started Modern Standard Arabic, but I didn't speak Arabic. I was doing it as a book language. But when I was in Beirut, I was able to take a class in colloquial Lebanese Arabic so that I could actually learn to speak the language. When I first arrived in Lebanon, I would say things from my Modern Standard Arabic. People would fall down laughing. It's like speaking Shakespearean English to someone. So I didn't know this at the time, but I was already set on a path because I had a friend in Cairo who was kind of a slacker, and I met him a few years later, and he was wearing a business suit and had a valise. And I said, "Dude, what happened to you?" You know, he was like a pothead originally.
Okay.
So he said, "Well, you know, we studied Arabic." I said, "Yes." He said, "You don't realize it at the time, but after a while, when you study something like Arabic, it's what you've got going for you." And so he had ended up being hired to teach Arabic as a second language. Okay. And this is what happened to me, is that, you know, scholarship runs along language lines. Exactly. And if you're going to be a scholar of Buddhism, then you would want to know Sanskrit and Chinese and Japanese and so forth. So since I had decided to learn Arabic, it's what I had going for me.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. I mean, just kind of a tangent. That period where in the 60s where people were experimenting with different types of spirituality. I mean, it seems that there was a point in American history where Sufism actually was quite viable as kind of one of these sort of alternative pathways. I mean, I think what ends up happening, like Sufism, Hinduism, and Buddhism, it seems like they were some of the three biggest ones, I think, that were kind of like competing for the spirituality. And it seems like Buddhism eventually ends up winning as kind of like the main one, I think. But Sufism, do you feel that, did it not really resonate with Americans because of the inherent qualities of Sufism? Or do you think it was the geopolitics of like Iran and things like that kind of made it less appealing to Americans?
Well, it's true that I think there's a lot more awareness of and interest in Buddhism among that community of Americans who are interested in Eastern religions. I don't think the Sufism ever really went away, though.
Okay.
I mean, there's a small minority of people who I mean, of course, there are many immigrant Sufis, like the Senegalese are all Sufis and so forth. But there, among native-born Americans, there's a certain interest in it, even to this day. Okay. There are directories of Sufi organizations in all the major cities and so forth. But it's a relatively small phenomenon. You're right, compared to Buddhism, and I couldn't tell you why. I mean, you know, this is one of the problems in the history of religions, is that we know things change, but people don't typically write in their diary the reasons for which they have made these changes. So I think that would be a big research project to do the interviews. And of course, we're trying to answer a negative.
Exactly. Why it didn't happen. Exactly. So you spent this time in Lebanon, looking at Christian-Muslim relations. I mean, what were some takeaways from that experience? What did you notice or understand, or kind of what were the challenges that Vatican II presented to the relationship between Jews and Muslims? I mean, between Christians and Muslims.
Christians and Muslims in Lebanon. Well, you know, in Lebanon, religion was very siloed. Right. And even I found, to my amazement, that I knew much more about Islam than most Christian Lebanese did. They don't talk to their Muslim neighbors about religion. So then they're ignorant, and like the Lebanese Muslims often didn't know very much about Christianity. That was why the dialogue movement was useful. So that was one of the takeaways, was how siloed people can be, and how ignorant they can be even of a reality that's lives across the door, across the hall from them.
But I mean, that's what I've learned generally, I think, in terms of like my own research in Africa and other places, is that you have very ethnic, multi-religious societies, but people simply do not talk about religion or really engage theologically at all. And I think that's a very modern phenomenon. I think that really comes out of kind of the modern interfaith movement. This idea that you can actually talk about your religion to other people in a way that is also not proselytizing, because I think that's another way that Muslims have kind of dealt with Christianity, is that like, okay, well, they're just trying to convert me, or, but actually just being able to understand so that you have a more harmonious sort of world, right? And a better understanding rather than just prejudice,
That's right.
Yeah.
Another takeaway was that as I did my research on this dialogue movement, I found I was hobbled by not knowing enough history.
Okay.
I needed to know more about the history of the Maronite Church, for instance, and the history of Islam. So I spent a lot of time reading history. That hadn't, I was a religion major, so it hadn't originally occurred to me.
Focusing more on the theology.
Yeah. And and then I liked reading the history.
Okay.
So it was one of my transitions to being a historian.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about that transition.
Well, I think the nail in the coffin was the Lebanese Civil War.
Of course.
After being graduated from Northwestern in 1975, I went back to Lebanon to try to do an MA in religion at the American University in Beirut. They were the only institution in the Middle East that offered a religion degree.
Okay.
Not a seminary kind of degree, but the history of religions as an academic discipline was actually practiced in Lebanon, and it really wasn't allowed in Egypt. There was opposition from some of the more hidebound clerics to the whole idea, but when I got to the campus, the war had broken out, and there was a big battle for control of the hotels downtown. You know how in the old World War II movies they talk about the need to take the hill?
Right.
So it's because it's high and you can dominate the surrounding area from it, set up mortars and so. But the same thing is true of tall buildings in modern urban warfare. So they were fighting for control of these tall buildings. It was nice tourist hotels, and they gradually looked like Swiss cheese. They had holes in them. You could see this happening from the campus of the American University in Beirut. It's up high, and you could look down on this. You could see the trails of the rockets and so forth. So they called us all together and said, "Go away. The university's not going to open this year, and we might see you next fall if things settle down." I went to Jordan for a while and then applied to the American University in Cairo. I saw the writing on the wall that Beirut
it's not going to end anytime soon.
Beirut was not going to settle down. And so I went to the American University in Cairo for my MA, and I was determined to do an MA in the area because I wanted to get my Arabic near native fluent. And you can't do that very easily in the United States. And in addition to which, I was reacting against the American academic tradition. People would go and do a 9-month Fulbright someplace and come back, and then they would be an expert in that for the rest of their lives, and they would mostly live in the United States. I wanted to know the ins and outs. I wanted to get deep. So I ended up living almost 5 years from the time I went to Beirut at first until I finally came back to the United States in the region. So I did an MA in Cairo, and they didn't have a religion program. They did have a history program. So I moved to history. I worked on kind of Muslim reformers of the 19th century, but from a historical point of view rather than a theological one. And then when I went to UCLA. I'd already gotten some training as a historian. I had started to think of that as my discipline. I also have to tell you that I reacted a little bit against the disciplinary underlying ideas of the history of religions as I was taught it as an undergraduate. We were under the shadow of the University of Chicago. And philosophically speaking, it was the phenomenology of religion that was ascendant. which is a little bit ahistorical.
Yeah.
You know, it was all about myth cycles and things like that. First of all, it wasn't very relevant to Islamic studies. Mostly, you know, it developed out of Hinduism and Christianity and Buddhism. And I don't know what myth cycles are there in Islam. I mean, that's silly. But then also, phenomenology seemed to be kind of detached from concrete reality, and I became interested in the way that history is researched, and the use of archives and personal papers, and getting deep into the details of a person's mind and thought at a level that I think the phenomenology doesn't allow. So I think also just personally and philosophically, I moved to being a historian.
Okay, that's very interesting. Then you ended up going on a Fulbright.
Well, when I went to UCLA for my PhD work, and I had gone back to Lebanon, by the way, in the meantime, and I worked for a newspaper there. Because we thought the Lebanese Civil War might be over in '78, and then it wasn't.
Yeah.
So I was working for this newspaper. Sometimes we couldn't put the paper to bed because the Syrian artillery had knocked out the electricity or things like that happened. And so I could see there wasn't a future for me as a newspaperman in Beirut. So I went to UCLA to do a PhD. But when I was in Beirut, it was during the Iranian Revolution. And the Iranian Revolution was a local story in Beirut because it has a large Shiite population, and the Shiites mobilized. And so our newspaper covered these kinds of things. And I was working mainly as a translator for the newspaper. I would take the Arabic wire services and put them into English. So I followed the Iranian Revolution very closely. And its local reverberations in Lebanon. So I initially went to UCLA because it had the best Iranian studies program in the country. And I was going to do my dissertation on Iran. And that was perfectly plausible. Even after the revolution, in the summer of 1979, a lot of American academics went to Iran for research. And relations between the two countries weren't at a nadir. Then the hostage crisis happened, and these guerrilla groups took American diplomats hostage, and it was a crisis for the next year and a half. Well, no embassy, no visas, no diplomatic relations. I couldn't do research in Iran. But I had done a lot of background research towards a dissertation on what I was interested in was the rise of the Shiite clergy as a ruling class. As where does that come from? Because there isn't any other modern country where the clerics came to power. There have been places like Franco's Spain where they were very influential, but to
seize power.
Seize power as a group in the same way that the military seizes power. That seems strange, and I wondered if there's something about Shiite traditions that helped to explain how it could happen. So I was reluctant to let go of the subject. And I thought, well, maybe I can do it as a manuscript library project. So I went to the manuscript library catalogs. As I got over into the India catalogs, I discovered, I was ignorant about this at first, I discovered that there had been Shiite kingdoms in India, Shiite-ruled kingdoms in India, between the fall of the Mughals and the rise of the British. And the manuscript catalogs demonstrated that these Shiite-ruled kingdoms had generated a lot of writing, they gave patronage to clergy to write things and so forth. And the manuscripts were sitting there. And I went to the secondary literature, I didn't find anything about it. It was not in the literature. There was an unknown subject. Well, that's what you want as a PhD student. So that's a place you can make your mark.
That's right.
So I applied for a Fulbright and a Social Science Research Council grants, and they accepted my application and sent me off to South Asia. So that was actually unexpected, but also a pleasant idea, because remember, I was interested in Eastern religions in India and Gandhi as a teenager in the late 60s. So there was a mystique of India, and I hadn't thought about being able to combine my interest in the Middle East and Islam with an interest in India. But here was the perfect opportunity. So I went off to Lucknow in Uttar Pradesh and made contact with the local Shiites. Some of them were at the university as professors, and so they could understand what I was doing and was interested in. And they just opened their hearts to me, and more importantly, their libraries, and including manuscripts. Now, I was from a generation of scholars of Islamics and the Middle East who were impatient with depending mainly on French and British archives for studying the modern period as your sources. And it hadn't really been known, I think, in the 60s, to the degree to which a very rich manuscript tradition survives. And it's only a small proportion of it ever was printed, but you could find these handwritten books produced in 1750 and 1790 and 1830. And since they're often unique, there was no copy of them made, you had to go to where they were held in order to use them. And so I was not alone in this. There were Peter Grant and others were beginning to use these kinds of materials and to make it known that they existed. And so I was able to write my dissertation primarily out of these primary sources written by Indians, often in Arabic and Persian, which mostly Indians don't read Arabic anymore. They know to recite the Quran, but they wouldn't read a book in it. And so I was doing things that even local scholars maybe wouldn't have done. And I was able to write a history of the of Shiite religion and religious practices in North India in the 18th and 19th century. And while historians had treated this period in this place, they'd mostly treated it as a chess piece in the British conquest of India, and it was all about diplomacy and economics sometimes and so forth, but an intercultural history of the Shiite practices in India, some of which were, in dialogue with Hindu practices and so forth, had not been done. So that was my dissertation, and it turned into my first book, and it got me the job at Michigan and laid a foundation for my career.
Wow, I mean, your work is like really, at least in English, is groundbreaking in terms of being able to show that, because I think people in South Asia knew that not only were these Shia kingdoms important, but they were also, in a way, kind of part of the creators of the high culture of Muslim, society, right? And the Shias especially, like, having an important part to play in that. It's very, very interesting. So then I'm interested in kind of like in terms of how you go from your kind of your more teaching kind of historical work to the more public-facing work that you kind of shifted to eventually. What took you in that direction?
Well, because I had done this MA in Cairo, and I had lived in Cairo in the 70s, and then I did the PhD work in India and Pakistan. I lived on the terrain on which the components of Al-Qaeda grew up. So when I was in Egypt, you read the newspapers, and 88 members of Islamic Jihad had been arrested that day. It was impossible not to be aware of it. And being specialized in Islamic movements, I was going to do some reading in it. And then when I was in Peshawar in 1982, the Afghan refugees had come, and that was, I didn't know it. I was in the same city with bin Laden and Zawahiri and the later leaders of Al-Qaeda, who were at that time running something called the Office of Services for the Afghan Mujahideen, or fighters against the Soviet invasion. So I came back to the United States. I got this job at Michigan. I was teaching my courses on the modern Middle East, or I taught some South Asia. I taught the Mughal Empire. But when 9/11 hit, the whole of America was seized with curiosity and fear and anxiety about what had happened. Who were these people, and why had they done what they had done? Well, I knew exactly who they were. I didn't have to look it up.
Right.
I'd lived with it. You can follow these movements at that time. They had internet bulletin boards and so forth. So knowing Arabic and Persian and Urdu, and having lived out there, I could easily answer people's questions about Al-Qaeda and 9/11. At the time, the major vehicle for intellectual exchange of a specialized sort was the email round robin. Okay. So you would just have a CC list of all the people who might be interested in this discussion, and you would send out a message, somebody else would reply. So you would have these internet discussions and dialogues. So I was on such a list. It was called Gulf 2000, which had been founded by Gary Sick, who had been in the National Security Council for the Gulf, and of course that was a place where a lot of these kinds of questions were asked by academics and policymakers. So I could answer their questions. And again, and the internet, it's really useful because it's a very fast medium. Right. It's a hot medium. It's useful if you don't have to go off for a week to do reading in order to come back and answer a question, because people will have forgotten the question was ever asked by a week later. Yeah. I could just answer their questions immediately. And so my answers about Al-Qaeda were very well thought of by my colleagues, and they told me so. And although that list was supposed to be internal to the group, in fact, people would forward it to other people. I would start to get fan mail from Denmark, and I liked your posting of October 7th and so forth. So then people would start writing me for back issues. And at the time, we used Microsoft Outlook, most of us, for emails. It didn't have a search engine. It was a little bit of a hassle to go back and find an old email and send it out again. So that was 2001, the winter of 2001 was when blogging started to become a well-known phenomenon. It had existed since 1999, but it was only then gaining a reputation. Andrew Sullivan was a prominent journalist who had started a blog, and there wasn't very much serious content still in the web blogs. A lot of cats. So I thought, well, I'll start a blog, and I can just archive my email messages there because I consider them public. And then when somebody comes looking for a back issue, I can just give them the URL. It would save me a lot of trouble. So that's in the spring of 2002. Okay. I started putting things up at this weblog. In the old days when the internet first emerged in the early 90s, the internet is different from, or the World Wide Web, I mean to say, when the World Wide Web first emerged, the web is different from the internet. I mean, the email can be the internet, but the World Wide Web has pages. And initially they were just index cards. And you couldn't scroll, and you couldn't really do anything but to write on the index card and display it. And the only movement you could have was a hyperlink. So you could link that index card to other index cards. And every time you put up an index card, you had to do what is called file transfer protocol. You had to design it and put it up manually, upload it manually. And then it would be a standalone document, only linked to other documents by the hyperlink. So you could go sideways, but you couldn't go up and down. So in 1999, this young software engineers invented Blogger.com, which had a window, and you could put text in and press publish, and it would FTP it for you. You didn't have to do it manually. And also, it would push down whatever text was there before and put this on top of it. So that just became much more convenient. And that was the software that we used initially, most bloggers, to put up their web pages. So, but then after a while, like it would be summer, and we professors don't teach in the summer, and I would have some time to do research, and I would be tooling around the web. And again, I knew Arabic, so I could find out things that other people couldn't. And if I found an interesting article about Al-Qaeda and its history, I would translate it and put it at the website. So I started making original entries. And the website, 50 people would come a day, or 75, or what. Initially, it was a small thing. And then Bush decided to invade Iraq. And those Shiites that I studied in India went on pilgrimage to Iraq. And there was a lot of back and forth between Iran, Iraq, and North India at that time, because India, the Indian Shiite kingdom of Awadh that I studied was rich.
Right.
And so there was patronage and pilgrimage and so forth. So 2 chapters of my dissertation were actually set in Iraq. I knew who the Iraqi Shiites were. I knew who the grandparents were. Right. And when Bush decided to go to Iraq, I was able to talk knowledgeably about Iraqi history and society. And then once Saddam fell, the Iraqis put up like 200 websites.
Right.
And then some of them were city oriented, so you could read local news, what was happening in a particular neighborhood.
Wow.
There was no censorship. So I could find out almost anything. A high-ranking U.S. general once wrote me in that period and said, "How do you know these things?" So apparently I was doing a better job than his intel people. And so I blogged Iraq. And once Bush decided to go to war there and send U.S. troops there, you figure he sent 100,000, 120,000 troops. Each of those has family, they have friends. Yeah. That's a big constituency of people who really want to know what's going on over there, because they're interested in the fate of their loved one. In addition to which, it was a national project. Bush promised the Americans he was going to turn Iraq into a beacon on the hill. They became emotionally invested in Iraq. It's so funny now if you think about it. We just had elections in Iraq last October, and I don't think the American public even knew that it happened. Exactly. But in the early zeros, that's the kind of thing they were focused like a laser on. So at the time, the blog technology was such that you would have a side panel in which it was called a blog roll, in which you would recommend other sites to your readers. Right. And so people who had a weblog that was in any way related to foreign affairs would suddenly put my weblog in their list as a hyperlink. And so when people finished reading an article on that site, they would go to the weblog, the blog roll, and click and come to me. And then there were some mega bloggers, people who had a big following, who would link to me. I woke up one morning and I had 60,000 hits. Wow. And in April of 2004, at the height of the struggles between the Marines and the Mahdi Army, I had 1 million hits that month. I'd never had 1 million of anything.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they called me on public television, the NewsHour, and even on cable news more generally, CNN. I even once went on Fox. The people were interested in what I knew. The Senate Select Foreign Relations Committee, then headed by Joe Biden and Dick Lugar, called me to testify because they couldn't get the Bush administration to tell them what in the world was going on over there. So I gained a certain odd sort of celebrity. I actually was recognized in restaurants in D.C. and I can remember I was in Minnesota giving a talk, and I paid the taxi by credit card, and the young man looked at it and he said, "Oh, you're the Juan Cole?" It wasn't the frivolous kind of Hollywood celebrity. I didn't have the pink limousine or anything like that, but I was very well known Well, it was C.P. Snow said that the celebrity is someone who's very well known for being very well known.
Yeah.
So I in a very minor way.
Okay.
I don't want to make too much of
Sure,
it,
sure,
but
sure.
I entered those ranks. But it was because the country wanted
Right. It was
the knowledge
interesting,
that I had. They wanted the analysis that I had. And I consulted with the government. I'd been against the Vietnam War and I marched against it. But with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, I thought the Iraq War was a bad idea. But I also wanted a soft landing for everybody. And then I really, really wanted to help do whatever I could to destroy Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
So the government called me to consult. I went and told them what I knew. I thought, well, I'm a public intellectual.
Sure.
The people of Michigan, for whatever reason, pay me to tell the public these things. So the government is part of that public. So I was willing to talk to other experts in D.C. and share that knowledge. So I kept expecting this to be a one-year adventure and to be over, but it lasted really until COVID.
Okay.
The people were interested
Right.
in Iraq, and then ISIL arose, and
Of
there was
course.
that.
Yeah.
So there was sort of 20 years there where a big chunk of my career was.
Yeah, it's a pretty big, big impact. I think.
Telling people about Islam in the Middle East,
Yeah.
and then I found that there was so much Islamophobia in my comments, and as hard as I tried to inform people, I couldn't always get through. Yeah. Then it occurred to me that maybe trying to explain radical groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL to people is not the best way to inform them about Islam more generally, because the Americans didn't realize it, but those are very tiny little sects.
Course,
almost nobody pays attention to them in their home countries, except to the extent that they're violent. And so I had been trained at American University in Cairo and UCLA and early Islamics as well. So I decided to write a book about the idea of peace in the Quran. As far as I could tell, there had not been such a book. But I find concepts of reconciliation, peace, moderation, and dialogue are throughout the Quran. Of course, Muslims know this, but the Western public, including the Western academic public, I think mostly didn't know it. And so that became my project from the middle of the last decade. Was I wrote a book about Muhammad and peace. I wrote a book about, I edited a book about peace movements in Islam, in which we looked at a whole range of them. There's a lot of peace movements in Muslim societies, but people don't think about them that way. They know about them. They had that horrible genocide in Bosnia, but after it was over and you had the Dayton Accords, there were Muslim women who formed organizations to work for conciliation with their Serbian neighbors and so forth. And there is a literature on this, but it's not in people's consciousness.
Yeah. We're we're nearing our time to end, but I'm interested in kind of what is your, you've had such a varied career in terms of the work that you've done. What are kind of the main takeaways that you would want, say, students who are interested in kind of learning more about either interfaith dialogue or kind of the Middle East more generally, what are some of the key learnings that you think that people just should know about the world, especially as we see it kind of things unfolding today?
With regard to the first part of your question about studying Islam, its history, its thought, the Victorians in the 19th century developed this notion of what they called the enlargement of the self. It was very common for people to go on vacation to Italy, for instance. And we now do this routinely, but in the mid-19th century, that was a boat ride, a pretty big deal. And mostly rich people did it. But also, we don't think about this, but they were pretty hardline Protestants, and they were going into a Catholic environment, and the churches were gaudy from their point of view and so forth. But then they would be exposed to this wonderful Renaissance art. And George Eliot, the novelist, who was a woman, but she wrote under a man's name, she talked about her trip to Italy and the way in which it was an enlargement of herself, of ordinary life, she called it. And so this was a whole concept in that period. And of course, it was a time when the Victorian world was sticking its fingers all over the world, but also the intellectuals and the cultural figures found beauty in these other cultures in a way that maybe the administrators did not. Exactly. So, the district commissioner of such and such place in India may not have fully appreciated the richness of the culture of the people that he was ruling over. So that enlargement of the self, of the ways in which you can become, that you can widen your horizons and deepen your understanding, that's something that's worth gold. And learning another language, another way of expressing yourself, understanding the concepts, because the world looks different when you know another language. Exactly. There's even an Arabic proverb, Kullu lisanin insan. Every language is a person. Right. It's like when you learn a new language, it's like you have a new personality incorporated into yourself. And although, as you say, there may be a lot more public interest in the history of Zen Buddhism or something like that, those Sufis in Islam are really interesting people, and they have fascinating stories to tell. Not only, we think about religion as sermons and homilies, but they like to tell tales, I mean, folk tales kind of thing, but with a spiritual import. Right. And they have very large books full of these stories, and they're more spiritual kinds of stories. They're not like the 1001 Nights, which are also very interesting. But anyway, I think that the study of that kind of literature is very rewarding in its own right, and it gives you spiritual insights that are useful in facing life. With regard to geopolitics, I mean, I don't think I have to really make a strong pitch for that. We don't understand the Middle East, but we rampage around it like an elephant in a china shop. And I have been both pleasantly surprised and deeply disappointed by my interactions with officials in Washington, because some of them were really on the ball and knew their stuff. A very large number of them were completely ignorant of the places that they were trying to run. I think that's unadvisable. I think if the U.S. public is going to go on having things to do with the Middle East, the public needs to get up to speed and do the reading and investigate.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Professor Cole. It's
thank
been
you,
an honor and a pleasure. Yeah, thank you.